Welcome to RUMC Connections. Welcome to RUMC Connections, the show where we bring you conversations with the experts of Richmond University Medical Center to help you better understand your health and the health of your loved ones. I'm your host, Meredith Gaskins, and today we're discussing a topic that has big concerns for many parents, your child's growth. So some of the concerns that typically arise are, is my child growing normally? Are they just on the smaller side? Or could there be an underlying medical reason? And when should you ask for help? So joining me today is Dr. Ishita Kharode, a pediatric endocrinologist here at RUMC who specializes in evaluating and treating growth and hormonal disorders in children. We'll talk about what's considered normal growth, the possible causes of short stature, how it's evaluated, and when treatments like growth hormone might be needed. So whether you're a parent who's been measuring your child's height on the kitchen wall or you just want to better understand how kids grow, you'll want to stay tuned for this episode. So just to give you a little bit of background, Dr. Kharode received her medical degree from St. George's University in Grenada, West Indies, and did her pediatric residency at SUNY Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York. She then went on to complete her pediatric endocrinology fellowship at New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell Medical Center in Manhattan, before coming to Richmond University Medical Center, where she is currently the chief of pediatric endocrinology, as well as the pediatric clerkship director. Dr. Kharode is also currently serving as the 219th president of the Richmond County Medical Society. So let's start with the basics, Dr. Kharode. So what is considered normal growth in children?
So that's a good question, and it varies based on the age.
Okay.
So up until 2 years, it varies because children kind of catch up or catch down compared to the size they were when they were born, compared to where they're sort of quote unquote supposed to be genetically, whether the parents are small or tall or whatever. But from age 2 up until children hit puberty, they're supposed to be growing at a rate of about 2 to 2.5 inches per year. And that's for both boys and girls. When puberty starts, the growth rate increases. And for girls, they undergo their growth spurt towards the earlier stages of puberty, and that could be anywhere from 3 to 5 inches a year. Same thing for boys, but that happens in the later stages of puberty.
Okay.
So it's important to take all of that into account when we're talking about what normal is.
How do pediatricians typically track a child's growth over time?
So typically this is done at their usual checkups. They'll check their height and weight. Typically for school-age children, it's once a year. So they'll track their growth, once a year and make sure that they're following that growth rate that I talked about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you explain the importance of growth charts and percentiles?
Yeah, so growth charts are extremely important for pediatrics to track the height, weight, make sure that both are increasing at a steady rate. You want to make sure that you're comparing it to the age, but you also want to take into context, and we'll probably get into comparing it to the child's genetics and how tall they're, again, quote unquote, supposed to be based on that. It's very important to take a look at the growth charts and not just one point in time.
Okay. What are the expected growth spurts at various ages? Like there's infancy, there's mid-childhood, and there's puberty?
Yeah, so during infancy, I think the only one of those that we really call a growth spurt is during puberty, but certainly growth during the first couple of years of life tends to be faster than in school-age children. It steadies out to about 2 to 2.5 inches per year in school-age children, and then you have your pubertal growth spurt.
Okay. So what role would you say genetics play in determining how tall a child would be? Could you have short parents who then have a very tall child?
Right. So the genetics relationship to growth is definitely a little bit more complex. A quick measure that we use is something called the mid-parental target height.
Okay.
And there's a formula that we use using the child's parents' heights to kind of calculate how tall we might expect the child to be. That number is more accurate when the parents' heights are closer together. If one parent is 5 feet tall, for example, and the other one is 6 feet tall, then that number is a little bit less accurate. But we use it just as a guide for how concerned we should be. If the mid-parental target is at the 75th percentile, for example, and the child is growing at the second, That's a little bit more concerning than whether, if the midparental is at the 10th percentile and the child is growing at the 5th. So we just use it to provide context.
So do you essentially create an average with the two parents'
It's
height?
sort of a weighted average. It's not an exact average, but it is sort of a weighted average. But as you alluded to, there are other genetic factors that go into as well. There may be influences from grandparents and that sort of thing. So we're still trying to fully understand the role that genetics plays, but we do know that it plays an important role.
Okay. What point would a parent be concerned that their child is not growing, quote unquote, normally?
So the main reasons to get concerned is if a child is not growing at a normal rate. So if they're not hitting the 2 to 2.5 inches that I mentioned, it's important to take that over the course of a year, though. Children don't usually grow the same rate month to month. So you want to make sure that you're giving them enough time to reach that. You're not just sort of measuring them every month and, worrying about that. But yeah, if they're not growing at a normal rate, or if, as I mentioned, their height percentile is very different from where their parents are, neither of those means that there's definitely a medical problem going on, but it may just be a reason to evaluate further.
Okay, so a child, say, who's been growing normally each year, the 2 to 2.5 inches, maybe their next annual appointment, maybe they only grew half an inch to an inch. Is that concern then?
Yeah, I think it bears further evaluation. As I said, it's not necessarily a cause for alarm, but just a reason to look into things further.
So what is the first step when there is a red flag?
I think that it depends on the pediatrician. Some may monitor them for a little bit longer to make sure that this is a persistent problem, because sometimes things even out the next year. Sometimes pediatricians will then refer to a pediatric endocrinologist for further evaluation. So it depends on the pediatrician, but certainly if this is a persistent issue, then referral is a good idea.
And you would typically just wait like another year to see if the growth catches up then, or?
You can probably bring them back in 6 months. Some people can wait a year. I wouldn't want to go too long, though, because it may be worth doing evaluation earlier in case there is something serious going on.
Is there a difference between being short and having a growth disorder?
Yes. Having a height that's on the lower end of the growth chart, that can be normal for a variety of different reasons. It can be what's called familial short stature, so the parents are both on the smaller side and the child takes after them. So certainly being on the small side doesn't necessarily mean that there's a medical issue. But, if someone is not growing at the normal rate, then there may be. And certainly there might be more than one thing going on. You may come from a small family and also have a growth disorder. So it's important not to conflate the two, but also important to remember that there might be more than one thing going on.
So let's get into the possible reasons a child might be shorter than expected. What are some of the common medical causes?
Right. So there's a lot of different potential causes. One important factor for growth is nutrition. So oftentimes I'll see children who not only are not growing at a normal rate, but their weight has also slowed down, or they may be unintentionally losing weight. So that can certainly impact height. And that can be caused by just, poor appetite, not eating enough. There may be some sort of feeding issues going on there, but also you're not absorbing the calories that you're eating. So you might have a great appetite, but if there's an intestinal issue like inflammatory bowel disease or celiac disease, that can affect both height and weight. There are also endocrine disorders, which is where I would come in. We typically think about growth hormone deficiency, but there are also other issues, for example, hypothyroidism. So not producing enough thyroid hormone can definitely cause short stature and a reduction in growth rate as well. And there are other more rare causes like various genetic syndromes. But as far as the most common causes, I would say probably the ones I mentioned.
Okay. What role do hormonal imbalances play?
There are multiple hormones important for growth, the most important being in prepubertal children, growth hormone and thyroid hormone. So if a child hasn't reached puberty yet, those are the two most important hormones for growth. And if you're not making enough of either one of those, that could impact growth. And then during puberty, testosterone and estrogen also kick in to play a role. And so if you're not producing enough of either one of those, then that can also impair growth as well.
You mentioned, thyroid disorders, growth hormone deficiency, and early and late puberty are the main things that really affect the height, right? Okay, so what about the nutritional or psychosocial factors? So It could be just from picky eating as well, maybe as they get older even too.
Yeah, absolutely. Picky eating. Sometimes it may be a sign of something more serious underlying, maybe a developmental issue. But yeah, definitely picky eating. There's some medications also that can curb appetite. For example, in some children, not all, but there are some children who are on stimulant medication for attention deficit disorder, for example, and that can also sometimes curb appetite in some children. So just some things to think about.
Do you notice any growth issues with children who are on ADHD medications? Do you find?
Occasionally, yeah, I have seen children who are on that. But, if a child needs a medication for another medical condition, then that's something that we would have to work around.
Yeah, of course. Okay. So a parent, comes in concerned about their child's height. Walk us through what an evaluation, would look like in your office. What type of questions do you ask during the initial visit, or lab work or imaging studies are typically ordered?
Yeah, so the first step is to determine whether there is actually a medical concern.
Okay.
Sometimes there may be a concern raised, but it's important to get enough information, like how much actually has the child been growing over the past few years. How is the child's growth right now compared to the parental heights? Is the child exhibiting any symptoms of any of the medical conditions that I mentioned earlier? Is there any cause for developmental concern about developmental issues? There's also important to get the child's birth history. Were they born early? Were they born appropriate, at an appropriate size for their gestational age? So there's a lot of information collected. And then if it does seem like there's a cause for medical concern, if the child is not growing at an appropriate rate or the child's percentile is low compared to what I would expect, then I would do a lab evaluation, basic lab evaluation, to evaluate for some of the causes that I mentioned. And then in some cases, I will also do an X-ray of the hand. That's called a bone age X-ray. I say in most cases I would do that. Sometimes if the child is very young, it may be less helpful. That allows me to look at the child's bones and the growth plates because the appearance of both of those things changes as the child grows and develops. What we do is compare the child's bone age, so how old their bones look or to what age that corresponds to versus their actual age. And that allows us to see how much more time they have left to grow compared to other kids their age. So it gives us a nice, a lot of information about how much cause there is for concern. Should we act more urgently, evaluate more urgently because we don't have as much time as we thought we did, because the child is going to be done growing sooner than we thought? Or do we have time to monitor and see how this goes? And it gives us a little bit of information about how tall the child might be expected to grow. It's not an exact estimate, but it does give us some information about that.
Do you notice that many premature babies end up growing to have growth disorders?
So it's not necessarily being premature. It's being small for gestational age. So if their size was small compared to what it should have been for their gestational age, how many weeks they were born at, then that and they don't catch up to where they should be compared to their mid-parental or genetic potential, as we call it, then that can be a cause for evaluation and treatment.
Once you determine the bone age, what does that window look like?
So for boys, their growth plates fuse together, which means that there's no more spaces left between the bones and the growth plates. And at that point, there is minimal to no room for further growth. So for boys, that happens at a bone age of about 16 to 17. For girls, it's about 15. And so the further you are from that, the more time you have left to grow. So that's really what we're trying to determine for that.
So 15, 16 is kind of the cap for...
In general, yeah. So, and that's for bone age, right? So it's not the chronological age. A boy, for example, who is developing on the later side, puberty-wise, if they are 15 or 16, they may still have some room for growth left if their bone age is behind compared to their actual age.
Interesting. Okay, so when is growth hormone actually indicated?
Determining whether someone has growth hormone deficiency is a stepwise process. The first step is to rule out other medical conditions. So with the basic blood draw that I mentioned earlier, we do some of that. So we test for hypothyroidism. We screen for gastrointestinal conditions such as celiac disease and inflammatory bowel disease. And then we also check growth factors, which are an indirect measure of growth hormone. Growth hormone is produced in the middle of the night. So we can't really measure it during the day reliably because everyone's levels are low. But we can do an indirect measurement by measuring these growth factors. Once we've determined that none of the other medical conditions seem likely based on the blood work, then depending on what the bone age shows, if we can either do further evaluation for growth hormone deficiency, or we can monitor the child's growth for a little bit. If the child's growth is not picking up, then we do what's called a growth hormone stimulation test. This is where we give 2 medications over a 3-hour period to stimulate growth hormone production. Then we measure the child's growth hormone levels in response to those medications.
Is it like a sleep study?
It's done in the morning.
Oh, okay.
It's done on an empty stomach in the morning. It's done as in the hospital as an ambulatory admission, which means that the child doesn't have to stay there overnight, but just for logistical purposes, we do it in the hospital. But because it is a 3-hour test, we don't usually start off with that unless we are really suspecting that someone may have growth hormone deficiency.
Okay.
And then we take all of those growth hormone levels that we measured. If at any point the child was able to make a growth hormone level above 10, that's great. That means that they're not growth hormone deficient. But if all of those levels were below 10, then that's consistent with growth hormone deficiency. And then, in that case, the child would be likely a candidate for growth hormone therapy. We do need to do an MRI of the brain first in these children because growth hormone is produced by the pituitary gland, which is in the brain. So we want to make sure that everything looks okay in that area, that there's no cause for concern. Most of the time there isn't. It's what we call idiopathic, which means we don't know the reason that this child isn't producing enough growth hormone. But it is part of the protocol, and then we would have a longer discussion about growth hormone therapy in that case.
So I didn't know that this was produced in the sleep. If a child was, say, a poor sleeper, could they put themselves into like a growth hormone deficiency?
So disordered sleep can definitely impair growth.
Yeah.
That's something. So sleep disorders such as sleep apnea, for example, can definitely lead to impaired growth. So if there's cause for concern for that medical condition, if someone is waking up multiple times at night, or sometimes if they snore and then they're very sleepy during the day, that could be a sign. So definitely it would be a good idea to get evaluated for that.
With the growth hormone, how is it administered, and are there risks or side effects?
Yeah, so it's administered as an injection. There are now both once-a-day versions as well as once-weekly. The once-weekly formulations are a little bit newer, but they've been around for a few years. So it is what we call a subcutaneous injection, which means it goes just underneath the skin, sort of similar to an insulin injection, for example. And it can be administered by either the parents or the child if the child is old enough and feels comfortable doing that.
Okay.
The most common side effects are really just pain and soreness at the site. Again, not too severe because it's a pretty shallow injection. It's not like, for example, a vaccine immunization, for example, that goes into the muscle, and so you can have lasting soreness with that. This is a little bit different. So that's the most common. There are some more severe side effects that we do talk to the families about. These happen in less than 1% of cases, but it's important to be aware of them. One of them is what we call idiopathic intracranial hypertension, which is increased pressure in the head around the brain. That can present as severe headaches, vision changes, so we always ask about that at subsequent visits. Another one is called slipped capital femoral epiphysis, or SCFE, we abbreviate it, and that's a sort of hip dislocation. And both of these side effects are not so much of the growth hormone itself, but rapid growth. So if a child is growing too quickly, then you can see these. We do, of course, try to titrate the dose very carefully to avoid these, but in very rare cases they may happen. In those cases, of course, we would stop growth hormone therapy at the time, get them further evaluated, treated, and then move on from there.
Okay.
And then the last thing we monitor for is increases in blood sugar. Growth hormone doesn't cause diabetes, but it can cause increases in the blood sugar. And so we monitor that through lab work.
Okay. So do they have to be a little bit more mindful of their diet during the time that they're on the medication to avoid the excessive?
Yeah, so I mean, healthy eating and exercise is important for everyone. There's no specific recommended dietary changes for children on growth hormone therapy, but just something to be mindful of just in general for their health.
What is the typical duration of growth hormone therapy for children? How long do they stay on it?
So the typical duration is until they're done growing, and this can be monitored in a few different ways. With the bone age x-ray that we talked about, so as the spaces between the bones get smaller and smaller, if they're essentially fused together, at that point the growth hormone is not really doing much. Also, if the growth rate slows down, which it does at the end of puberty to less than an inch a year, then that is also an indication to stop. Of course, at any point during growth hormone therapy, if the child, the family they've discussed this and they don't want to continue anymore, either because they're happy with their height or for whatever reason. They can, of course, stop at any time. Mm-hmm. There is a small percentage of children who require growth hormone as adults. These are often children with other pituitary hormone deficiencies as well, but not always. So that is true for a small percentage of people, but for most children, the endpoints that I mentioned are the most common.
Okay. Is it ever used for non-hormonal causes of short stature?
So there are other indications for growth hormone therapy besides growth hormone deficiency.
Okay.
So FDA-approved indications is what I mean. So conditions, there's some genetic conditions, for example, Turner syndrome, which is a chromosomal abnormality, Prader-Willi, which is another chromosomal abnormality. So those are a few of the indications. There's multiple other ones, also being small for gestational age, as I mentioned, and they don't catch up to where they're supposed to be. Those children can also be treated with growth hormone therapy. So there are other reasons.
Right. So are there limitations or ethical considerations around growth hormone use?
So the main considerations are just to make sure that we're treating appropriately, that we're treating children who are growth hormone deficient or who have one of the other conditions that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. There are some children who have what is called idiopathic short stature. So that means we don't know why they're small. They're not growth hormone deficient. They don't have anything else that we can test for. And that's defined as the height being less than 2 standard deviations below average for their height. So there's a very strict definition of it. And some of those children may benefit for growth hormone, but it's important to make sure that we're treating for medical and health reasons and not, because we want someone to be taller cosmetically. That gets a little bit into the ethical considerations, especially because, as I mentioned, growth hormone does have potential side effects. And we don't truly know the effect of treating someone who is growth hormone sufficient. Mm-hmm. It can cause other health problems, like I mentioned. So you want to make sure that we're treating appropriately.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some things that parents can do proactively to help with their children's growth at home, say?
So the main thing is just make sure that they're eating healthy food generally. Of course, there's treats here and there, but generally a healthy diet, exercising, which for, younger children just means playing. We don't have to necessarily sign them up for a gym or have them join an intense sports team, but just getting some physical activity in. And really the most important thing is just be aware of when to worry. Of course, they're going into their pediatrician's well checks once a year, so the height should be monitored. But in between that, if there is a concern, just knowing what some of the red flags are and bringing them up so that if evaluation is warranted, you can get them to a specialist.
Okay. Can stress, either physical or emotional, can that impact a child's growth?
It can. I don't know that we have a full understanding of how that works, but certainly there can be psychosocial issues that affect the child's appetite and food intake. Okay. Something we haven't talked about is socioeconomic factors as well. Mm-hmm. If the food just isn't available, mm-hmm. If the family is struggling to get food on the table. So there can be other psychosocial reasons as well, and certainly mental health conditions and other issues like eating disorders. So there's a lot of things that can go into both height and weight.
Are there, any sports or physical activities that support or sometimes hinder growth? I feel like I'm going to say it's a myth, but you could verify. Sometimes people say that a sport like gymnastics might keep, a shorter stature. What is the truth behind that?
So I don't think it's the physical activity itself. I do see a lot of children who are pretty active in sports, but may not be eating enough to support that physical activity. So of course you're expending calories when you're doing gymnastics or soccer or whatever sport you're doing. And if you're not eating enough, if you're not consuming enough calories to balance it out, then you may lose weight or may not gain weight to support good growth. So that's really the main thing you want to be aware of, is making sure you're getting enough nutrition to support whatever physical activity you're doing. But sports itself is not going to make you shorter.
Okay. Thank you for debunking that myth. Does screen time have any indirect effects on growth?
It can, in a number of different ways. So if screen time is affecting the child's sleep, for example, a lot of kids are up late on their phones or tablets or whatever. And that can certainly impair their quality of sleep, which can also indirectly affect growth hormone production. If they're more sedentary because they're having a lot of screen time during the day and not really doing a lot of physical activity, or some kids even skip meals because they're in the middle of whatever they're doing, whether it's video games or what have you. It's not a very common thing, but I have seen it here and there. So it can indirectly affect growth. But yeah, definitely you want to make sure that you're being judicious with your screen time for a variety of health reasons.
Do you think teens need more sleep as they're going into such a rapid growth phase in their development? You know, sometimes parents joke, oh, lazy teenagers, they're sleeping so late. But is it because their body just needs that additional sleep time to produce that growth hormone since they're going through such a rapid,
So teenagers definitely should be getting at least 8 to 10 hours of sleep. The most important thing is to be consistent in that sleep. A lot of times children may be sleeping late on weekends and then not on weekdays and things like that. And so, yes, sleep is important, but you also want to make sure that you're being consistent about the timings of your sleep.
Are there any conditions that maybe cause temporary pauses in growth?
I guess the medical conditions that we mentioned earlier can lead to growth issues if they're not treated. But as far as temporary pauses in growth, it may just be that if you're checking the child's growth too often, from month to month, maybe between January and March, the child only grew a little bit and then it'll pick up during the next few months. So there can be issues like that. That's why we look at it over the course of a whole year or 6 months at the earliest.
Okay. What would you say is the biggest misconception you hear from parents about growth hormone?
I think the biggest misconception in general is just not understanding the steps that someone needs to go through to be diagnosed with growth hormone deficiency and conflating short stature with growth hormone deficiency. As we mentioned, there are so many different things that can cause short stature besides growth hormone deficiency. So I think it's important to understand that growth hormone is not the treatment for all children with growth problems.
Okay. What's on the horizon in pediatric endocrinology, research that could maybe change how we treat growth disorders? Is there anything that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, the newest thing is the weekly growth hormone formulations, which definitely make things a lot easier for a lot of children, having to just do a once-a-week injection instead of daily injections. And then I think just studying more about the genetics of growth and what goes into that so we can have a better understanding of that.
Okay. So if anybody has concerns about their child's growth, it's important, like you mentioned, to talk with the pediatrician and if needed, ask for a referral to a pediatric endocrinologist. Richmond University Medical Center is here to help. And you can schedule an appointment with Dr. Kharode by calling 718-727-1366. That's for her 1366 Victory Boulevard office, or by visiting Castleton Avenue, and that is 800 Castleton, 718-818-4570. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been another great episode of RUMC Connections. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode and share this conversation with someone who might benefit from it. Until next time, stay healthy and stay connected. If you like this podcast, be sure to check out the rest of our library in the YouTube playlist, or take us on the go, available on all streaming platforms.